On This Week in Enterprise Tech, Intel says the future lies in the cloud. Microsoft is storing data in your DNA. And your next big threat is from within. Try it on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twit. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 187, recorded April 29th, 2016. PEBKAC. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Are you hiring? With ZipRecruiter.com, you can post to more than 100 job sites, including social networks, all with a single click. Screen, rate, and hire the right candidates fast. Try ZipRecruiter with a free 4-day trial now at ZipRecruiter.com/Twit. Welcome to Twit. This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. But of course, I can't guide you by myself. For that, I trust my stalwart co-workers, my co-geeks, my co-nerds in the enterprise business, starting with Mr. Curtis Franklin from Information Week Radio. Curtis, so good to have you, my friend. How are you doing?
Padre, it's good to be here. I'm just getting ready to start folding up my studio to head to Las Vegas, where all next week I'm going to be at the Information Week Elite 100 Conference and Interop.
Fantastic. I'm assuming that you'll be bringing us some radio goodness right from the show?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The show will be broadcast live from the Information Week Elite 100 Conference. The Information Week Live will also come from Interop, and then there will be plenty of great interviews happening that will be parceled out in judicious fashion for weeks to come.
I am a fan of judicious fashion. Of course, my fashion is black, but let's go ahead and welcome the other co-host here. Normally, it would be Brian Chi. He would have the spot, but he is currently sweating his Hawaiian back off at Interop, getting everything set up. So we're very happy to have Lou Maresca, Senior Development Lead from Microsoft. Lou, you're getting some accolades from the TD desk. You're popular over here, my friend. How have you been with Lou 2.0?
Doing great. Yeah, he's doing great, and keeping busy myself. We're doing some security reviews of everything that we're doing at work, and we're releasing some stuff soon, so we're excited.
Well, gentlemen, we've got a great show for our audience. We're going to be talking a little bit about a DDoS attack, how it netted one group $100,000 for no work at all. And we're also going to be talking about the insider threat. This is something that's uncomfortable for enterprise folks, but most of the time, the big threat, comes from inside your walls. But before we do that, let's go ahead and jump straight into the blips. Now, in speaking of that $100,000 DDoS attack, cases of ransomware are on the rise, with attackers preying on improperly secured networks and poorly trained users to hit IT admins with disrupted networks and compromised data in order to get a dishonest payday. But what if you could steal as much cash just by the threat of disrupting a network? That's precisely the twisted story but that DDoS protection and web security vendor Cloudflare discovered after investigating the Armada Collective, an extortion group that has monetized their elite hacksaw skills without actually having to demonstrate them. The MO of the Armada Collective is simple: spam as many corporations as possible with emails threatening to DDoS them if protection money isn't paid in the form of 10 bitcoins. If the demands aren't met, the price goes up 10 bitcoins every day that the attack continues. According to Matthew Price, CEO of Cloudflare, more than 100 businesses have received the emails, and enough have paid the extortion to net the Armada Collective at least $100,000, all without Armada launching a single DDoS attack. In fact, Price continues, because the collective reused the same Bitcoin addresses over and over again to receive payment, they wouldn't be able to determine who paid and who didn't, leading analysts to believe that many companies just fell for a not-so-well-constructed bluff. Furthermore, since the members of the original Armada Collective, who did launch several 60 gigabit per second DDoS attacks, are currently incarcerated after a 2016 bust, this might have been the easiest black hat payout ever.
Intel's CEO says the future lies in the cloud and IoT. After laying off 12,000 employees, that's about 11% of the company's total global workforce, Intel CEO Brian Krzanich decided it was time to tell the survivors and the rest of the world how Intel is going to survive and thrive. He did this in an April 26 blog post that laid out Intel's strategy in a 5-point outline. Among the 5 points, the presence of the cloud and the growth of the IoT market are undeniably true. In response, Intel plans to focus innovation on high-performance computing, big data, and machine learning capabilities. A third point was that there's much more value to unlock from the cloud and data center, and that analytics is the key to doing it. Fourth and fifth points covered the importance of 5G wireless technology and the prediction that Moore's Law will keep chugging right along. He made space in the post to reassure everyone by writing, "Our strategy is based on these premises and the unique assets that only Intel brings to them. We are in a time when technology is valued not just for the devices it produces, but for the experiences it makes possible."
Twist Bioscience from San Francisco has signed a deal with Microsoft to sell them 10 million man-made DNA strands, or long oligonucleotides. DNA doesn't just store the blueprints to living things anymore. It could possibly store unstructured and structured data as well. Microsoft is exploring the idea of using DNA molecules to store massive amounts of data. It's not just for Johnny Mnemonic anymore. 1 cubic millimeter of DNA can store up to 1 exabyte, or 1 billion big gigabytes of data, safely and securely for up to 10,000 years. So to put this into some kind of perspective, today's hard drives can have an average lifespan of 3 to 5 years with consistent use, and 30 years for tape. In the future, people might be drilling out amber for mosquitoes to obtain your DNA for the movie database you had this year.
Less than a year after Comcast's bid for Time Warner Cable went down in antitrust flames, U.S. regulators have approved a $78 billion acquisition of the latter by Charter Communications. The deal, which also includes Charter's purchase of Bright House Networks for $10.4 billion, will turn Charter into an edge ISP giant, standing alongside top-tier providers Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon. With the corpse of the Comcast-Time Warner takeover barely cold, some are wondering why antitrust regulators approved the acquisition, but a glance at the deal stipulations gives a pretty good picture as to why. The new entity will be prohibited from implementing data caps, charging additional fees, or charging user connect fees for internet content providers. FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler is enthusiastic about the deal, as long as the stipulations are followed for 7 years, especially since they seem to take direct aim at some of Comcast's less popular policy moves of late. The deal, which will take effect on 1 in 6 American households, still needs to make it through the official FCC vote and a May 12th meeting of the California Public Utilities Commission. But as the new charter could finally give Comcast real competition, the IT world is cautiously optimistic.
Dropbox Infinite wants to solve your storage problems forever. On April 26, Dropbox publicly introduced Project Infinite, a feature that provides access to all of an enterprise's files from any desktop, regardless of the local device's hard drive size. When a user views her documents, files synced locally will feature the green check mark familiar to Dropbox users. Everything else will have a small cloud icon beside it, visible on the desktop, but taking up no local space. To open a file, just click and it syncs in seconds. Know you're headed for a Wi-Fi dead zone? Right-click a document and choose Save Local Copy. The feature is similar to the placeholder files capability Microsoft offered early on with OneDrive, but then eliminated in a Windows 10 update. It's a feature that enterprises will look at very hard given the combination of growing files and shrinking client devices.
Judges are given the authority to search your device across state government lines. Judges are now can officially grant warrants to search electronic devices from any city. The U.S. Supreme Court has approved the change to Rule 41 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure to allow for this authority. The details of the ruling state that this type of warrant can be granted if a suspect uses tools to hide their identity, such as Tor. Again, it's open to interpretation, so it seems that even encryption might be considered a quote-unquote tool. Congress has until December 1st to discuss and negate the ruling, or the amendment becomes a law.
Now, tech giants can't be tech giants unless they have a workforce that can dream, build, and maintain the next great whatever it. That's why Bill Gates, Tim Cook, Satya Nadella, Rami Rahim, and almost 50 other leaders through the tech, education, and finance industries, signed an open letter to Congress urging support of the teaching of computer science in every K-12 school across the United States. The Computer Science Coalition has collected $48 million in private contributions to do just that, and the open letter asks Congress to allocate $250 million more to give school districts across the country the resources they need to develop student-appropriate CS content. While the idea of offering the option of CS training for all students sounds like a net gain, the coalition would be wise to follow a similar battle that is being waged across the pond, in which concerned citizens in the EU are balking at mandatory computer science classes for K-12. Bottom line, we as tech people can't say anything but good come from an education that includes knowledge of the increasingly necessary technological underpinnings of modern life in a developed country. But maybe we need the help and the tact of those not so inclined. Well, that does it for the blips. Next up, we're jumping into the bites, and this one is a little bit different. We wanted to cover a story that hit hard this last week because it touches on a lot of the unease that IT managers and IT folk have when opening up their networks to the internet. And that is the idea of being DDoSed, being extorted, ultimately being breached. So we've brought in specialist Ofer Gayer. He is the product manager at Imperva Encapsula to talk to us about the Armada Collective. Ofer, thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, tell us a little bit about this story. Now, we heard about it in the blip. The Armada Collective was a group of black hats who were able to DDoS some high-profile sites. They used a combination of techniques, most notably amplification attacks, to hit certain providers with 60 gigabits per second of traffic. Now, a large part of their group, the more active members, were arrested late last year, sent to prison early this year, and now there's a new group that's calling themselves the Armada Collective that has been bulk emailing businesses and essentially saying, pay up or we're going to hit you. It sounds silly, but they managed to collect $100,000. What are the other details of this? What do we need to know about the Armada Collective? What do we need to know about this extortion threat?
So let's do a small kind of overview. Extortion has been big recently. There's the very popular ransomware software. And in the past couple of years, we've seen extortion DDoS. And extortion DDoS started with a group called DD4BC, DDoS for Bitcoin. They extorted many companies, many organizations. They did launch attacks, not big ones. We've seen a few. We actually wrote about this. They claimed to have hundreds of gigabits of bandwidth in their botnet. Well, in fact, it's a few hundred megabits to a few gigabits, nothing that any mitigation provider can't easily protect against. They were taken down. They were followed by the Armada Collective. The Armada Collective also launched attacks. Some say 60 gigabits. We've seen a few that have been a little bit bigger, but nothing that's what we call, like you said, amplification attacks, the garden variety of DDoS attacks, nothing that's very unique. They targeted specific targets at once, going through verticals, going through targets one at a time, extorting, launching an attack, telling them, pay us if they don't pay, launching more attacks. Some pay, some didn't pay. And they were, as you said, taken down. Then came this group of copycats. And you can see they're copycats first and foremost because they target thousands of targets simultaneously. They don't go after a certain vertical. They don't launch attacks, usually, most of them. And they have different kind of persistency. Some will go after, some will engage with the target, some don't. I'm not sure about the numbers of that being published, about 100K being paid. Could be more, could be significantly less. I think that most targets usually decide not to pay. And those, like you said, we've seen several. Some had the same Bitcoin address associated with them. Some had different Bitcoin addresses. All the addresses that I've seen have not had any transactions coming into them, so I don't have any proof of addresses we've seen targeting used in extortion letters addressed to our clients that have been paid to. And actually recently, fresh news from yesterday, there's a new group. And what's interesting there is this group claims to be associated with the Lizard Squad. Now, Lizard Squad are different. Lizard Squad are known to launch very big, significant attacks targeting very large infrastructures, Xbox, the PlayStation Network, Blizzard.
Normally near the holidays where they know that people will really want their services up.
Yeah, this was a big story in the previous Christmas. And they take on very high profile targets, and they tweet about it and they talk about it, and they don't ask for a few Bitcoins. They ask for either much more or just do it for what you call like the shits and giggles kind of thing.
The lulz.
Publicity, the lulz. Some of them have been taken down as well, but some of them still handle some Twitter feeds. They supposedly launched the new DDoS for hire service as well. And now, yesterday, we've seen a flood of extortion attempts targeting various verticals, many of them all in the same day. I've confirmed this with associates from other industries, big and small. All got the same exact email from the same address with the same Bitcoin blockchain address for payments, claiming to be from Lizard Squad. Lizard Squad has not made any public announcement about this. No attacks have been witnessed so far. All attacks are said to be launched in the upcoming days, and we'll have to see about that. This also looks like some sort of copycat, but it's very interesting. They kind of chose to use the Lizard Squad instead of the Armada Collective. We'll have to see if this is the same kind of MO used. Maybe someone read those publications about how easy it is to extort companies and thought he wants part of the game as well.
Ofer, let me ask you about this, because DDoS attacks are, they're considered by security professionals as sort of, it's the script kiddie attack. You don't need a whole lot of skill. You just need a botnet under your command or several botnets that you aim at a particular address. So we're not talking about lead hackers here. These are not people, or at least this particular activity that they're partaking in doesn't require a lot of skill. It doesn't require a lot of planning. It's just turn on the hose and wait until they pay. But we've seen this, along with ransomware, which is also not a terribly sophisticated attack, has become incredibly popular because they know that they can get payment. And yes, maybe the return rate is incredibly low, but we do know that a lot of these groups do get paid off just because a company is saying, look, I give you $1,000 now, or I lose $50,000 in business. What's it going to be? Is this kind of attack ever going to go away?
Well, first of all, about the premise of DDoS attacks being only used by script kiddies. So there's a whole spectrum of DDoS attacks. So you can launch DDoS attack using a simple script, targeting a network using amplification attacks, small ones, and to take down most soft targets. But we've seen very sophisticated DDoS attacks. The DDoS attacks aimed at the major players were not your garden variety, not in terms of size, but also in-depth understanding of how networks are built, what are the soft spots of different upstream providers, how they can bypass different techniques used by DDoS mitigation measures. And that shows deep understanding of networking and how things work. Also, with the application layer front, we've seen we call the equivalent of advanced persistent threats of someone getting hired to take down a website, interfere with their service, building a very large botnet, using very advanced bots that very accurately masquerade as legitimate users, generating false traffic, solving CAPTCHAs, doing very low rate from hundreds of thousands of sources. So very advanced. It's not something that a script can be downloaded and executed. So there's a whole spectrum. Obviously, the more popular ones are the simpler ones, but I wouldn't say that all DDoS attacks are simple and require no knowledge. So that's for the one. About the trend, no, it's not going away. It's not going away because it's easy. The amount of effort required to launch a DDoS attack is if you have $10 in your pocket and you go to a stressor service or booter service, what they call, and pay them a few bucks, and you can take down any target. So we call it like the arbitrage. So you invest a few dollars in renting out a botnet or actually a DDoS for hire service, send out the threat mails, and once all it takes is one organization or company to pay, and your arbitrage turns positive and you make a profit. If you automate that process, you can make, has been claimed, $100,000 a day, maybe more. Ransomware have been known to make millions of dollars in very short terms.
Right. We've been speaking. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback. Speaking with Ofer from Imperva Encapsula. I want to thank you for joining us. We're going to have you back actually in 2 weeks. So we're going to be talking more in depth about DDoS attacks, more about mitigation that we can take. So I want to tease that. I want to talk too much about it. But if you could please tell the audience a little bit about you, a little bit about the work that you do, and where they can find that work.
So I work at a product line called Encapsula by Imperva. I used to be a security researcher, senior security researcher at Encapsula. And what we do is we cater DDoS mitigation, web application firewall, content delivery, and load balancing from the cloud. We have our own technology. We write extensively about what we find. Having this huge network helps us get the best research out there because we see what's going on. We have a very good knowledge of what's going on, and we kind of customize our technology to give us that level of visibility. If you want to read some of the work I've done and my colleagues, you can go to blog.encapsula.com, and we'll discuss this more in 2 weeks.
Ofer Gayer, product manager from Imperva Encapsula. Again, we thank you for joining us for This Week in Enterprise Tech.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Curtis, Lou, so you've been listening to us talk a little bit about DDoS attacks, about ransom, about malware that makes it onto your network. This is sort of the new reality for IT administrators out there. They're not just going to be dealing with technical problems on their network. At some point, if you run a big enough network, you're going to be called in for your advice on how do we mitigate this threat that we've received from X crew that they're going to knock us off the net, which could cost us money. Lou, you deal with a rather large corporation, and I know that corporation has had to put up with a lot of continuous attacks, not just the occasional. How far down the chain do these decisions make it?
So, I mean, most of the time it's done by, your normal ops team. So like, different groups like Azure, CRM, they all have different types of ops teams that make decisions based off of throughput and traffic. And so, and they're constantly analyzing things and they're throwing up alerts and so on, depending on what's going on. So, and they all have plans for failover and, load balancing and so on, depending on what type of attacks they might get. So, I think, unless there's some kind of like you said, if there's some kind of a breach somewhere where there's somebody sleeping within the network itself and they hit nodes that are not necessarily under the detection screen, then most of the time large corporations like these, like Microsoft and Google and so on, can detect and mitigate fast enough because they have the ops teams kind of looking for it, watching for it. So I think that's, but smaller corporations don't necessarily have that. So there's always other techniques to follow when it comes to smaller SMB type situations too.
Curtis, You speak a lot with executives, and I know you're going to have an interesting time at Interop talking about these sorts of issues. But when you are dealing with a group of executives who maybe receive what might be considered a credible threat from an organization that has struck before, and they make what sounds like a relatively low request for payment, maybe 10 Bitcoins or so, $10,000, whatever it might be, to not attack the infrastructure, it can be very enticing. So what advice would you want to give to an executive who's maybe considering paying some protection money?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is quite enticing. And for some companies, it's in the same category as people who file very small damages suits, for things like falling down on the premises. If they want less than $5,000 or $10,000, you just pay them and move forward. The real question is whether that should be your corporate strategy or whether you should have the corporate strategy that some other companies follow, which is no matter how insignificant the threat, you refuse to pay. Just as a matter of policy, you fight it. If that's your policy, and I think there are some real arguments that can be made in favor of the essentially we don't negotiate with terrorists kind of policy, then you have to have things in place so that you can work with your upstream ISP so that you have failover capability, ideally on an entirely separate network, so that if your IP address pool gets poisoned because of the DDoS and other upstream providers start shutting off access to your address pool, that you still have the ability to be found and to get traffic in and out. It's one of these things that involves a basic business philosophy. Arguments can be made in either direction, and you really have to know what the executive committee wants to do. This is something that goes all the way to the very, very top of the organization, outstripping any concerns that come solely from IT.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We will be picking this topic back up in 2 weeks, and I think it's going to become more and more important. Lou actually mentioned in the chat that as more and more of our services move into the cloud, as we come to expect it to be able to host more of our infrastructure, it's also more vulnerable. It's much more vulnerable to a group or an individual who just happens to have a large number of bots and can throw traffic at our boxes. Well, when we come back, we're going to be speaking with Morgan Gerhart. He is the VP Product Manager, the VP of Product Marketing at Imperva. He wants to talk to us about the insider threat. Are you prepared to protect your network from your users? But before we do that, let's go ahead and take a moment to thank the sponsor of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. And I want to start by asking you a question. Do you want the perfect hire? Well, of course you do. I mean, the people that you hire, that's the skill that you bring into your company. That's the talent that you'll be drawing upon for the next big idea, for the next bit of inspiration, for the next $1 million idea. But how do you get that perfect hire? How do you get that talent? How do you get that skill? Posting jobs in one place isn't enough to find those quality candidates, and short staffing leaves you very little time to post to dozens of job sites, sort of casting your net across a wide area as possible. But thanks to ZipRecruiter.com, you can post to 100-plus job sites with a single click, reaching job sites, popular social media destinations like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, pretty much all of the places frequented by the talent that your business needs. With ZipRecruiter.com, you just post once, and within 24 hours, you can watch your candidates from any city or industry nationwide roll into their easy-to-use interface. You can search by skills, by location, by experience, and more. ZipRecruiter will automatically match potential hires with your precise needs. They've even created a responsive design that works on desktops, laptops, and mobile devices, complete with a mobile application process so that you won't miss any potential great hires as they move from job to job, business to business, great talent to great talent. Now, there's not going to be any more juggling of emails or calls to your office. There are no more prolonged back and forth sessions. You just screen, rate, and hire the right person fast. That's the ZipRecruiter promise, and that's what they're going to deliver to you. They've been used by over 800,000 businesses, and you can try it now for free. Getting the right people for your company is so important. Do you really want to leave it up to chance? Right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/Twyet. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Twyet. Access millions of resumes on ZipRecruiter with thousands of new ones added daily. ZipRecruiter is the fastest way to hire great people. Once again, go to ZipRecruiter.com/Twyet. And we thank ZipRecruiter for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Let's go to my favorite part of the show, where we bring in yet another expert to deep dive a little bit on a topic that a lot of us find uncomfortable, and that is the threat from within. Morgan Gerhart, welcome to the show. You are the VP of Product Marketing at Imperva. First of all, could you explain a little bit about what Imperva is? We just had Ofer from Imperva Encapsula, and I know our audience might be a little confused as to why your companies sound very similar.
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So Encapsula is a product line within Imperva. Imperva was founded about 14 years ago with one mission in life, and that's to protect what matters most. And what matters most in a digital world is data. That's what has value to enterprises. That's what is actually of value to the cyber criminals that are out there. And when we take a look at what Imperva does, is we help protect against the ways that cyber criminals make money with data. One way that they make money is they DDoS the apps that sit in front of that data using extortion attacks, as we just talked about.
Right.
You know, another approach is they'll exploit weaknesses in apps and use those weaknesses to go directly at the data behind those apps. Or they'll compromise an insider, or maybe the cyber criminal actually is an insider, and they'll go directly at the data stores. That's in essence what Imperva does.
Morgan,
we don't do that. That's what we protect against.
Right. I was about to say, wait a minute, you don't. Yeah. That's not what you do. That's what you stop from being done. But let's talk a little bit about that, because this idea of insider threat, it is such a nebulous term, and it's such a charged term, because at its basis, it means there's someone who you trust who you shouldn't be trusting. And that is a nightmare scenario for any administrator, not just for an IT person. But Imperva specifically has been looking at whether or not the security tools that we use right now can be used to also detect threats from within a network. Most of those suites are used to detect threats from without. When I'm being attacked, when someone is DDoSing me, how do I mitigate it? When someone is trying to breach my authentication protocols, what processes are they using? Where are they coming from? Those are the sorts of metrics that my security tools will keep. What did Imperva find about using those tools against threats from within?
It's a great question. So ultimately, and you're right, insider can be a nebulous term. And in some cases, there's the nightmare scenario, which is it's actually a malicious insider. So somebody who's trusted, who's been given trusted access. And for all intents and purposes, all of our employees are trusted. As you were talking about earlier, if we didn't trust them, we wouldn't hire them. If we don't trust them with our assets, they can't do their job. So everybody's trusted. So like you said, there's the nightmare scenario, which is the malicious insider. But there's also the problem that cyber criminals have become so sophisticated in the ways that they are able to compromise our employees, that once an employee is compromised, and it could be because their credentials get compromised through a phishing attack, or they in some way, shape, or form get infected by malware or something like that. In that case, the attacker has, for all intents and purposes, assumed the persona of that insider and has the same rights and privileges of the insider as well. So when we look at the threat from within, we actually look across both of those. And our belief is, in the end, breaches are found at the intersection of users and data. If you think about it, to get to data, in one way, shape, or form, an attacker is going to have to take on the persona of a user that has access to that data. But you need to be able to look not only at what the user is doing, but also what that user is accessing to ferret out the acts that are dangerous or malicious from just an employee going through the everyday course of their jobs and their activities. So when we look at it from that perspective, first and foremost, to protect against that, you need to know where the data is and who has access to it. And that in and of itself can be a big problem when you think about just the sheer vast number of databases, file servers, and new data store technologies that are out there, not just in production, but also when you start thinking about dev and test systems that may have had sensitive data that's valuable to hackers copied into it, or analytical systems or any of the other systems out there that may wind up housing sensitive data. Just having certainty around where it is and how much of it is sensitive is in and of itself a very significant problem. Once that's understood, then there's the task of actually monitoring who has access to it, who's accessing it on a day in and day out basis. And even a relatively moderately sized organization, if you think about the number of employees versus the number of times they access data on a day in and day out basis, even once you have that visibility, the amount of data that gets collected just on who's accessing what is monumental. So the real challenge then is to sift through that to identify the incidents within that where in some way, shape, or form, trust is being violated or trust is being abused. And then of course, there's the last thing, which is once those things are identified, there's the need to quickly remediate, which generally means taking some sort of action to put a user into quarantine or block access to certain sensitive database types or data records or applications or whatever it may be, while an investigation is ongoing to make sure that nothing untoward is happening.
Now, you're talking about behavior analysis, because this is actually a hot topic in the security community, where the old style of security, looking at ports, looking at servers that are being accessed in what particular way, that isn't really good at looking at behaviors, and behaviors are what you want to stop. What kind of behavior analysis has Imperva been using to figure out when an action is malicious versus just normal business?
Right. So the way that we look at it, fundamentally, what we look at is we look at not just who the user is. We do look at that, and by looking at that, we also factor in a lot of what you mentioned earlier, which is some of that networking type stuff. So we look at who the user is, we look at what their domain credentials are, we look at what endpoint they're coming from, we look at from endpoint, we can determine subnets. So are they coming from a different part of the network than normal? We can look at all of those kinds of things as well. We also understand what systems they're trying to access. And of course, you can get visibility into that at the network layer as well. So sometimes that could be destination IP or destination port or things along those lines. And that stuff is, understanding that level of detail is critical. We have, since the day we were founded, we've also been looking specifically at helping organizations monitor data activity and data access. So not just what systems are being accessed, but once that access is happening, what's being accessed within it? What are the SQL queries? What tables are being accessed? Are those tables application tables with sensitive data, or are they just metadata tables? We're looking at rows returned, number of rows. Is the data that an employee is accessing or an insider is accessing the same data that they've always accessed, or are they accessing different data? So again, by looking not just at, if you will, the network elements associated with the user behavior, but also having direct visibility into the elements around what data that user is accessing, we're able to look at, if you will, kind of both sides of the equation. So again, if breaches are found at the intersection of user and data, if you want to apply behavioral analysis correctly, you need to have visibility into both. Now, behind the scenes, we're using a lot of the, if you will, some of the same math, machine learning that others are using. Our take is machine learning is it's a technology, it's a tool. You need to understand the tool to know how to apply it, but there's a lot more to it than just understanding the tool. You need to have the visibility, the native visibility into what you want to apply that tool with, and you also need to have a domain expertise to know what to look for. So what are the things, the tells, if you will, that would indicate that a privileged user is abusing their privileges? What are the things that would potentially indicate that somebody is abusing like an application service account and using that application service account to access data that shouldn't otherwise be accessed? What are the things that would potentially indicate that a user that is suddenly accessing more information than they normally have is doing it because there's something wrong, as opposed to they're just running like a monthly report or things along those lines? So when we look at it, it's really about understanding not only who the user is, but the data that they're accessing as well.
Right, and actually that follows up on a report that was just put out by IDC on insider threats, talking about how much of the data that's taken out of a network doesn't necessarily happen from a breach, not from a malicious hack, but from a lateral move that was given to a user. Some user had access to data that he or she shouldn't have, and then it was moved out of its secure location. So
Right.
Thinking of it that way, and thinking of it in terms of a insider threat being any time data is moved from a secure location to a place where it's less secure. Well, how do we stop that? I mean, what are the things that Imperva recommends to its clients in locking down data stores and locking down those lateral moves and keeping users out of the areas that maybe they should be in, but not without authentication?
Right. So I think that there's a couple of things that are happening there. One is, first and foremost, should that lateral move be happening in the first place? So we think at the foundation, first and foremost, there's the need to immediately identify and detect the actions that are causing data to be moved from, if you will, a secure and monitored location out. That is the foundation. So that, again, first requires knowing in the first place where there is sensitive data and being able to monitor it, and then being able to detect the move. The second thing is, if there is a business reason for that move to occur, there are techniques that can be used to, quote unquote, allow that move, but if you will, desensitize or mask that data. So say, for example, I have a production database, and I have a development group that is going to be working on version 2 of my application, and therefore they need to have data and realistic data to test against. There's a couple of options you could do there. One is you could make a copy of your production data and now have your sensitive data living in 2 different places. And then you could apply the same controls around that development copy that you would apply on your production copy. And some people do that. We would never advise just moving it into the production, or moving it from production into the development copy and then not monitoring the development copy. That's, as you said, the way that a lot of these breaches happen. So that is one approach. Another approach is, if you will, I can render that data useless to a cyber criminal or to a malicious insider at the time of the move by doing what's known as masking. And what masking allows is, in essence, I take, say, something like Morgan Gerhart with my social security number, 123456789, if I'm doing my math right. And every time I see Morgan Gerhart and 123456789, I change it to Bob Smith, and I change it to 567891234. So from a testing perspective, that data still does exactly all the things that I needed to do. And I can do that every time I see Morgan Gerhart and I see Morgan Gerhart's social security number. So referential integrity is maintained. All of those things happen. I'm still running my production against, running my development against, if you will, realistic production data. But since I've changed it, it no longer has any value outside the organization. That is another approach. But the key thing is to apply that kind of thing, you got to know where the data is in the first place, because there are places where it just needs to live. That's a fact of life. And you've got to be able to have your eyes on it and, as rapidly as possible, identify and detect when you see something untoward going on, so that the right controls, so that can be prevented, and then the right controls can be put around it.
Right, right. Actually, we've got a really good question, a series of questions from Emily the Strange in our chat room. She had a question about, first of all, social engineering. When an employee is social engineered to give internal data out to an external attacker, would that fall under your insider threat definition? But the more interesting question for me is she asks about psychology, the use of psychology, because essentially what you're describing in behavioral analysis is trying to figure out what an employee might do, even if it's not malicious. What would be human nature if an employee has access to data that he or she doesn't really need access to, whether or not they would give it up for the sake of security of the enterprise. So let me throw that at you. First of all,
right.
the psychology question. When you start looking at behavioral analysis, Imperva itself did issue a statement saying just knowing what people do isn't enough. That's not enough to lead you to the cause of a breach. That's not enough to let you fix a potential data leak. So where do you go from there? How do you actually guess what those humans will do with the access that you've given them?
Right. So that's a great question. And really, this is all about context. So first, I should mention that in addition to behavior and analytics, there are some things that we do to add additional context to that behavioral analytics. And what we do is we use an approach that's known as deception technology to add that context. So the way to think about deception technology is they're traps, bait, etc., that you put on employees' endpoint devices. So these would be things like, say, for example, a fake cookie or a fake session token or a fake file or a fake cached credential. We do this in a way that's entirely passive. There's no agent or anything running on the device. They just kind of sit there. A user going through their normal course of action on a day in and day out basis will never come across one of these things. But if a user gets socially engineered and their credentials get compromised so that a cyber attacker, a cyber criminal can log in as them, or if usually through social engineering, which is the way that most malware infections happen today, a cyber criminal gets malware onto a user's device, generally what they start doing is reconnaissance, and they look for the exact kind of things that we're planting. So the combination of something different combined with the context of a deception token being tripped, provides a very strong indicator that there is something untoward going on. So, that's one way of providing context. Another way of providing context is in the context of the analytics is what are known as peer groups. And baselining a user's behavior, not only to that user's behavior over time, but also to that user's behavior over time relative to the behaviors of their peers. So for example, if Morgan Gerhart accesses customer data on a record-by-record basis for 20 business days in a row, and then on that 20th business day, I suddenly access a massive amount of customer data, that's an anomaly. That may or may not be bad. If Morgan Gerhart's a call center operator, a customer support representative, or something like that, and every other one of my peers is doing the same thing, that's a classic example of a strong indicator that we did our jobs for a month, and then at the end of that month we had to do our monthly TPS reports, and we're all crunching data to tell our managers what we're doing. If, for example, however, I'm the only one who did that, the context, by understanding what my peer group is doing, indicates that something very, very different is happening. If that's combined with the fact that I did it at a different time of the day and it's data that I've never accessed before, that's another bit of context, if you will, that is also an indicator that there's something highly unusual and it needs to be investigated. Now, there's something embedded in here as well, which is we're not believers that this stuff will replace people. People will always be involved in incident response. the key thing is arming the people that are doing that incident response with as much context as they have, as they can get, and at the same time, keeping the number of incidents that they're managing and monitoring to a manageable level. Because at a certain point, if somebody comes in the morning, it doesn't matter whether they have 200, 2,000, or 20,000 incidents. 200 is too many. The key is identifying the things that are truly worrisome that need to be investigated further.
All right, let me go ahead and bring my co-host back into this conversation because they've sort of been chomping at the bit while we've been enjoying ourselves. Curtis, I want to start with you. This idea of an insider threat is very difficult for IT managers because they have to admit that they should be watching their users as much as they're watching the people outside of the network walls. How do you breach that conversation? So when you're speaking with a group of executives, do you just have to outright say, how much do you actually trust your employees?
I think some of it gets to the question of trusting your employees, and some of it is a question of not so much trust in their ethics as just trust in their infallibility. It's not just when I talk to executives. I have talked to a number of pen testers who told me that they have social engineering attacks prepared, but in many cases, the companies will not let them perform those tests because they're afraid of what will happen in the minds of the employees who fail the test. They're worried that even if it's an inadvertent fail rather than an educational opportunity, it will be seen as a reason to fire them. So many managers take the standpoint that they would just rather not know. And that's dangerous because we are all fallible, no matter how well-trained, how intelligent, how well-intentioned we are. And the question of trust is one of those things that gets tied up in our language, because right up there with trust is a question of blame. And we hate playing blame games. We have that structure. So I think moving the conversation away from trust in their honesty and figuring out who you can blame to one of testing to see whether or not the training has been effective. Testing to see whether or not your systems are helping them be effective in their defense against social engineering. Those are better avenues for discussion than some of the very blunt discussions that we're apt to have when we're in the middle of an attack.
Morgan, do you run into that a lot? The attitude of the breach that I don't know about is better than the vulnerability that I've documented and can be subpoenaed for?
Much less so now than maybe a couple of years ago. And I think that there's a couple of things going on there. First and foremost, there's rising awareness all the way up to the board level that cybercrime is an issue that's not going away. And this is, the point that you were talking about with Ofer, which is, in the end, there's money in this. And if you look at the risk reward for cybercrime from the criminal's perspective, it's actually not that bad. And it's the reason that it's turned into a whole entire industry. And as long as there's money to be made, there's going to be people trying to do it. So I think that there's rising awareness at the board level that that mentality can no longer be maintained. The other thing that's happening is the variety of breach disclosure rules and the financial penalties and things along those lines don't hurt at all or help in terms of putting the focus where it is. I 100% agree with Curtis that this isn't about blame, and it's not about trust when it comes to honesty as much as it is infallibility. Our CTO and co-founder has a phrase, and it's not his alone, which is you can't patch people. People by definition, myself included, we're not infallible. We will make mistakes. We will succumb to phishing attacks. I almost succumbed to one just the other day. One thumb click on my mobile device device away from it when it comes right down to it. There was, a financial services institution was breached. They did an internal phishing test, and 20% of their employees fell victim to the test. 20% of their employees aren't, dumb. It's just that people that do phishing attacks have gotten very, very good at using the same personalization and marketing techniques that professional marketers do, and they're able to blast out what might look to you and me like a very targeted spear phishing attack to 10,000 people. The techniques have gotten so sophisticated that like I said, it's about realizing that people aren't infallible. And I think that security professionals have long known that when it comes to enterprise security posture, the biggest uncertainty has always been the people. I agree that the crux of the problem is raising that awareness to the overall business leaders, like Curt has said, in a way that's not about, this isn't about a blame game or your employees are dishonest. It's just about the facts of life in terms of how people behave.
Lou, I want to bring you in here because you did have an interesting insight that you put into our private chat, and that is when we talk about sensitive data and when we talk about the insider threat, people having access to files that maybe they shouldn't have access to, information that shouldn't be at their level, there is this issue of the fact that sensitive information gets generated all the time. And unfortunately, it's not enough to say, okay, this is Mary's files, this is Paul's file. Paul is at this level of management and Mary's at this level of management, therefore she should have access to everything over here. Sometimes you do require your users to actually grade the sensitivity of the data that they've created. Do you run into this?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of businesses tend to follow patterns where, like, for instance, they have something called JIT access to things, where it's just-in-time access, where they control access based off of when they need the information, and then they lose access over time. There's also ways of some businesses rate their documentations by LBI, with low business impact, all the way up to high business impact. And depending on if, let's say, your document's high business impact, then that information that you're storing on, let's say Doc Store, SharePoint, or whatever, becomes encrypted, DRM gets enabled, tracking abilities, that kind of thing. But like you said, for insider documents, you control the origin of the information and you can kind of control where it's stored and how it's stored. But if you don't control the origin of the information, or it leaks out of the network somehow, then you basically have to be ready for recovery. So I think, like Morgan and Curtis have both pointed out, people are fallible, and organizations just have to be ready to recover at any point in time.
Morgan, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I wanted to give you the last word in this discussion. So if we have right now in our audience a IT manager, someone who will be reporting on the vulnerabilities in his network at some point in the near future to his executives, what advice would you like to give in looking at the tools that they may have deployed across the enterprise and looking at the policies that they may be enforcing with their users? What are some of the things that they can do? What are some of the low-hanging fruit that they can take in dealing with insider threats?
Yeah. So I think that ultimately what this comes down to, again, is the first thing that we would recommend to anybody who's worried about the breach or the implications of a breach is the first thing that's necessary is you got to know where the data is. And then you need to have eyes on who's accessing that data in real time. And the reason that we would say that, quite simply, is that that is ultimately what determines identifying a breach within a matter of hours or days, limiting the extent of that breach to maybe hundreds of records or thousands of records, as an example, and knowing what was taken versus, the industry average right now, I think, is 184 days. And in many cases, people literally don't know what was taken. It's interesting, if you look at a lot of the public breach reports that are out there, part of those breach reports are how much was taken. And in a lot of cases, the official answer is unknown because the visibility and the monitoring wasn't there to actually know what was taken. And in those cases, the way the breach disclosure laws work is you have to assume that everything was taken.
We've been speaking with Morgan Gerhart. He is the VP of Product Marketing at Imperva. We want to thank you very much for your time. Thank you for explaining this difficult issue, because it's not easy to talk about what your employees should be doing on the inside of your security apparatus. If you could please tell our audience where they can find you, where they can find Imperva, and where they could go to find a bit more about looking at behavioral analysis inside the network.
Absolutely. So Morgan Gerhart, I can be found at morgan.gerhart@imperva.com. The best place for information is www.imperva.com. And actually, I would advise people to take a look at Defense Center, which is where our research team posts all their research. That's a good place to start in terms of what's out there. There's obviously a lot of other information on imperva.com as well.
Morgan, we thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you on another episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech.
Thank you so much, Padre.
Well, folks, you've done it again. You've used up another hour listening to the best dang enterprise podcast in the universe. That's according to 9 out of 10 employees who are improperly doing their security inside your network. I want to thank everyone who makes this show possible. Of course, to Morgan Gerhart for being our guest, but special thanks to my co-hosts. I wouldn't want to do this show without them. Let's talk to you first, Curtis, because you will be heading off very soon to Las Vegas, where you will be wheeling and dealing. You'll be rubbing shoulders with some of the greatest in IT. Could you please tell the folks where they can find your work, where they can find Information Week Radio, and, of course, where they can follow you at Interop?
Well, Padre, you're right. Just off camera here, I have a stack of Pelican cases that I'm going to be filling up as soon as Twiat has come to an end. I'm going to be reporting in print form, in audio, video, through Twitter, through Facebook Live, you name it, I'll be doing it. The center for all of that is going to be at informationweek.com. Look for all of our Information Week Elite 100 coverage there. Also, all of the staff coverage from Interop. There will be pointers, there will be links. You won't be able to miss it, so just come to informationweek.com. We'll make sure you have all that you need from Interop for the next week.
Thank you, Curtis, and I'll see you soon. And, of course, Lou, it is always a pleasure to have you on our co-host stage. It's a lot of fun. I mean, since the early days of Twiat, again, you were on the 3rd episode of Twiat. You were co-host with me on Coding 101. You've been on half a dozen other shows on the Twit TV network. I don't know where you find the time, but when you do find the time, where can people follow you and your exploits?
Absolutely. You can always find me at Twitter, at LouMem. And, of course, all my work at Microsoft is found at crm.dynamics.com. And look out for some new releases coming soon there.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much for being Twiat. I also want to thank you, the person who tunes in each and every single week. Without you listening, without you watching, we wouldn't have a show. We wouldn't be able to talk about the stuff that we hold the most dear, and that is how the world communicates. We want to make it easy for you to get This Week in Enterprise Tech into your device this and every other week. Just go to our show page at twit.tv/Twiat. There you'll find a drop-down menu where you can get all of our back episodes, all the different versions, and you can also subscribe. So you can get, say, the audio version in your iPhone so you can listen on your way to work. You could get a video version on, say, your Android tablet so that you could watch us on your break. You can even get a high-definition video version for your desktop, your laptop, your Mac, your PC, your Roku, wherever it might be, so you can watch us at home in all our HD goodness. Again, that's twit.tv/Twiat. Don't forget that you can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/PadreSJ. If you follow me there, you'll be able to find out what topics we're going to be covering each week, and you'll also be able to suggest topics and guests for future shows. I'd say roughly a third of our guests and our topics have come from our audience there, so why not be part of the Twiat Riot? Speaking of being part of the Twiat Riot, we do this show every Friday, 1:30 p.m. Pacific time, live.twit.tv. If you watch, you can watch the pre-show, the post-show, and all the bloopers. And as long as you're watching live, why not jump into our chat room at irc.twit.tv. You can be part of the show as it's happening. You can ask questions. I'll ask them of the guests. And again, be part of the interactive experience that is Twit TV. Finally, thanks to the people in the Brick House who make the show possible. Of course, that means Lisa and Leo for letting us do Twiat. That means Karsten, my super producer. And the man who I think has caused me the most grief, but also the most laughter at the Brick House, Mr. Brian Cranky Hippo Burnett. Brian, this is normally the time where I ask, what exactly do you do here at Twit?
It's funny you asked that, Padre, because we do a lot of shows together. It surprises me that you forget so
I've got a
often.
really bad memory,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
maybe just tell me again.
Well, we do Know How together on Thursdays, and then it also airs on Mondays, How To Show. We've been working on FPV 150 quadcopters. Is that ringing any bells?
No, sorry, I don't know this quadcopter thing you're talking
Well,
about.
Padre, if you wanted to follow me, you could go to Twitter and follow me at cranky_hippo, but I have a sneaking suspicion that you busted me posting hippo GIFs on Twitter earlier.
I was just wondering why my TD was on Twitter while he was supposed to be TDing my show.
Aren't you supposed to be doing a show instead of following me on Twitter?
That's not what we're talking about now, right? That's totally different. That's not related. Yeah.
Back to you.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the Digital Jesuit, and I just want to remind you, if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise world, just keep quiet.